For decades, one of the most widely repeated explanations for China's rise among the business elites was that China's miracle wasn't mysterious. They copied the best model on earth, Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore, and just scaled it up. It described China as a version of Singapore running on a continental-sized engine, disciplined, pragmatic, technocratic, and focused above all on long-term growth. It's a narrative that appealed not just to investors, but to Western policymakers, Asian business elites, and even segments of the Chinese public itself. It's neat, it's elegant, and it places China's rise in a comforting frame. This is Singapore, but bigger, and therefore inevitable. But now look at China today. Falling foreign direct investment, FDI, shrinking population, real estate collapse, rising tariffs, supply chain relocation, debt stress, and political uncertainty. The question becomes then, if China really was Singapore at scale, why doesn't it behave like Singapore under pressure? That's the question this episode tackles. Welcome to Global Risk Profile, where we break down the headlines that matter and the ones that should. The Singapore theory of China rests on an attractive set of assumptions. 1. Singapore discovered a formula for authoritarian competence. Lee Kuan Yew built a state that was both disciplined and efficient. It had low corruption, high-quality civil service, forward-planning bureaucracy, social stability, world-class infrastructure, strategic clarity. Many believe China, especially after Deng's reforms, had embraced exactly this formula. 2. China admired and consciously studied Singapore. This part is true. Deng Xiaoping said in 1992, quoting, "Singapore's social order is good, and they run things well. We should learn from their experience." Chinese delegations visited Singapore repeatedly. Singapore's Housing Development Board, CPF system, and civil service structures were closely examined. Lee Kuan Yew was probably the foreign leader most admired by multiple generations of Chinese officials. He was invited to China dozens of times. He privately briefed Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongzhi, and later Hu Jintao. 3. China mobilized massive domestic savings, just like Singapore. Many Western investors admired this deeply. They argued that China, like Singapore, didn't need Western capital because its own people saved so much, allowing the state to invest in highways, ports, factories, power grids, etc. 4. The CCP's governance was seen as rational, consistent, and technocratic. For decades, it seemed like the party delivered growth. That success made it easy for foreign observers to assume it had achieved something close to Singapore's disciplined, rules-based administrative machine. Put together, these ideas formed a powerful and seductive story. China is Singapore scaled up. Not an ideological giant, not a Soviet relic, but a pragmatic, developmental state powered by discipline, competence, and savings. But underneath that story, the foundations were already different. We have to give our business elites credit. They did see something real. The early decades of China's rise did look like a larger version of Singapore's development model. So where was the analogy correct? First, China admired Singapore's efficiency. China did try to emulate elements of Singapore's bureaucracy and housing model. 2. China's early technocrats were genuinely capable. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, there were some technocrats in leadership, like Zhu Rongzhi, Wen Jiabao, who were skilled in economics, engineering, fiscal management. 3. China used savings to build infrastructure at massive scale. When you have high savings that translate to investment, that translate to growth, that translate to more savings. It seemed to have worked for decades. But here is where the analogy begins to fray, because the two systems rest on entirely different foundations. Singapore is a rules-bound system. China is a party-bound system. This is not a surface detail. It is the structural difference that determines how each system behaves under stress. In Singapore, contracts are enforceable in independent courts. Legal predictability is a strategic asset, and the ruling party does not sit above the law. In China, courts answer to the party. Regulations change when political ideology or leadership changes, and uncertainty is inherent, not accidental. Also, Singapore's institutions create trust, while China's enforce compliance. Singapore earns social discipline through legitimacy and predictability. China enforces discipline through political authority and conditional rights. And also, saving in Singapore signal prosperity. In China, they signal insecurity. We will explore this deeply in the next segment. Also, China's growth was far more dependent on global markets than the self-driven narrative admits. While Singapore benefited from globalization, China became the single most important node in the global industrial system. That global dependence makes China far more vulnerable now than Singapore ever was. The analogy was compelling, but partial, and the parts that were missing are exactly what increasingly matter today. Many Western business leaders believe China succeeded because it mobilized enormous domestic savings, just as Singapore did. This is the critical misunderstanding. Singapore's saving system, the CPF, is built on trust. Citizens trust the state to protect their assets. They know the rules won't suddenly change, and pensions are predictable, healthcare is subsidized, and property rights are secured. The savings reflect confidence. China's saving system is built on fear. People save because they must. Healthcare costs can destroy a family. Education costs are rising relentlessly. Pensions are weak and uncertain. Property is leased, not fully owned. Demolitions happen with little warning. Banks offer artificially low interest rates. Capital controls trap savings inside China. And political campaigns can suddenly wipe out companies, industries, or entire fortunes. China's high savings rate, often above 40% of GDP, is a sign of insecurity, not prosperity. During boom times, fear-driven savings can fund rapid growth. During slowdowns, fear-driven savings freeze consumption. Exactly what we're seeing in China today. This is why Singapore can absorb shocks gracefully, while China's shocks compound. Also, the growth miracle was never funded only or even mainly by those famous domestic savings. For example, from 1990 to 2010, China was the largest recipient of foreign direct investment in the world. Foreign direct investment routinely covered 10 to 15% of total fixed investment, which was around 30% of GDP in those boom years, and it brought technology, management know-how, and global market access. Singapore never needed anything like that volume of foreign capital because it was a small, open trading hub. China's model was different. Authoritarian direction, forced domestic savings, and massive foreign capital and export markets. Strip away the FDI and the export boom, and the self-reliant savings story doesn't hold water. When the global environment shifted in the late 2010s and early 2020s, China entered its first true stress cycle since the reform era began. That stress test revealed exactly why the Singapore analogy was superficial. Foreign direct investment is collapsing. For the first time in more than 25 years, net FDI flows turned negative out of China. The IMF and independent economists have confirmed this. Capital is leaving China. Why? There are unpredictable regulations, data security laws, due diligence firm raids, arbitrary detentions and exit bans, fear of sanctions if China supports Russia, rising labor costs, US and EU investment screening. Singapore under pressure attracts capital. China under pressure sees capital flee. Also, the real estate engine has stalled permanently. Real estate directly or indirectly drove roughly 20 to 30% of China's GDP. Now, Evergrande has collapsed. Country Garden seems near collapse at the end of 2025. Home buyers refuse mortgages on unfinished buildings. Local governments lost their primary revenue source, which is land sales. Singapore's housing is stable and managed. China's housing has become a liability. Also, debt levels are enormous. Total Chinese debt, which is central debt, local debt, corporate debt, developer debt, and shadow debt, likely exceeds 300% of GDP. Local government financing vehicles, LGFVs, are insolvent across dozens of provinces. Singapore never allowed anything remotely like this. Also, in addition, demographics are collapsing. China's fertility rate is near 1.0, lower than Japan at its worst. Population is shrinking. Working age population is shrinking. Marriage rates are collapsing. Urban youth unemployment is at crisis levels. Another point is that we don't really know how disastrous COVID was for China in terms of deaths, because they're lying. Singapore manages demographic issues through immigration and stable policy. China faces them under uncertainty and political rigidity. We are also seeing supply chains moving out to Vietnam, India, Mexico, Malaysia, and Eastern Europe. They're all gaining as China loses. US and EU tariffs are rising. Multinationals are reducing China exposure for risk reasons, not cost reasons. Singapore thrives under global realignment, and China is weakened by it. This is the stress test moment where the Singapore analogy stops working entirely. For decades, the world believed China was on a straight line trajectory. More growth, more power, more global influence. The new reality is more fragility, more uncertainty, more reactive policy. Policy flexibility is shrinking. Singapore can adapt quickly and transparently. China faces political risk in every form. Fear of social unrest, fear of weakening party control, pressure on local governments that are drowning in debt. Rigid systems become brittle systems. The private sector is retreating. After the tech crackdown, the tutoring crackdown, property crackdowns, and intensified ideological campaigns, China's entrepreneurs have become cautious or have left entirely. Singapore attracts entrepreneurs. China today sees them depart or hide. Global de-risking is structural, not cyclical. This isn't a slow year, it's a generational shift. Supply chain diversification, export controls on advanced tech to China, deepening geopolitical suspicion, reduced access to Western capital pools, and a growing sense that China's governance is unpredictable. The world is recalibrating around the idea that China is, at the very least, a strategic competitor with a fragile domestic model, not a Singapore-style hyper-competent state. China's leverage is weakening. When China was the world's factory, it held structural leverage. As supply chains move, that leverage shrinks. Singapore did not need leverage, China did, and it's losing it. Business elites saw something noble in both Singapore and China: the power of discipline, of long-term planning, and a focus on national uplift. They admired Lee Kuan Yew sincerely. They admired China's early pragmatism, but they missed the deeper truth. The truth that defines every authoritarian model in history. Systems built on fear can perhaps rise faster than systems built on trust, but systems built on fear cannot adapt as fast as systems built on trust. Singapore's strength is not that it is authoritarian. Its strength is that it created predictability, rule of law, and alignment between society and state. China's system created speed, scale, and mobilization, but not predictability. And now, when the world shifts, unpredictability becomes a liability that fear-driven savings, massive infrastructure, and ideological discipline cannot fix. The miracle story is over. and a new chapter is beginning, one defined not by emulation of Singapore, but by the consequences of the differences the analogy never captured. For us, the lesson is simple. Discernment means looking beneath the surface, separating what is admirable from what is fragile, what is scalable from what is not, what is Singapore from what is merely the illusion of Singapore. And once we see that distinction clearly, China's current challenges are no longer surprising. They're inevitable. One more note before we end. We've mainly discussed economic policy here, but there are other kinds of policy. It does seem that Singapore in recent decades has aligned itself more and more geopolitically with the CCP. This is another kind of systemic risk Singapore itself is now facing, as the globalization is bifurcating, and it is getting harder and harder to step on two boats at once, as the old Chinese idiom goes. 脚踏两只船. That's it for this episode of Global Risk Profile. If you found this useful, thoughtful, or just different, please subscribe, share, and leave a review. Remember, the headlines may change, but the deeper patterns rarely do. Thanks for listening, and stay sharp.